Okay, so we start again. Welcome back to this afternoon of the first day of the conference. Now we have a session with contributed papers and then another lecture. First of the contributed paper is by Alan McKay from Queen's University in Belfast. The title of the paper is Constitution, Mechanism and Downward Causation. You have 30 minutes for your talk, and there will be 10 minutes for discussion. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to everybody, the organisers, especially Sarah and Francesca, for doing a great job with all the preparations for this. And I'm very pleased to be here. Unlike most people here, I'm not a professional philosopher. I took it up in retirement and became interested in, among other things, Professor Baker's work. So my subject is slightly peripheral to the main themes of naturalism and first-person perspective. I'm going to discuss some aspects of Professor Baker's views on causality. These are mainly set out in her earlier books and papers in which she developed the Constitution account, though they also feature in chapter 10 of the present book. So what I'm going to do, first I'm going to briefly review Professor Baker's Constitution account and the causal arguments she uses in support of it. Then I'll present my own account, which distinguishes our ordinary causal explanatory practices from what I argue is the form of the actual causation that relates the non-intentional objects of our world, and for reasons that I'll come to, I call this manifest physical causation. I'll apply this picture of causation to Baker's examples and argue that if it's correct, the examples don't succeed in, as she puts it, vindicating irreducible intentional causation with mental causation as a special case. However, I'll go on to claim that Professor Baker's Constitution theory itself has the resources to overcome these difficulties and provide a robust account of mental causation. I want to suggest that ordinary or manifest physical causation and intention-dependent, including mental causation, are quite distinct and do not interact with each other at all. I'll argue that the two kinds of cause operate only at their own level, but that in the right circumstances, lower-level causal relations constitute higher ones, analogously to the constitution of objects and properties on Baker's own account. So the idea is that there are two basic kinds of causation, two basic kinds of relation: causation between events at the same ontological level, and constitution linking events or other relata belonging to different levels. Finally, I'll suggest that a case of what Baker takes to be downward causation, a direct effect of learning on brain structure, is better interpreted according to the schema I'm presenting. So just to remind you, on Baker's account, in material constitution, an object at a lower ontological level, such as a piece of marble, in the presence of favourable circumstances, comes to constitute an object at a higher level, such as a statue. While in property constitution, a lower level property of an object or event, such as being a hand raising, constitutes in favourable circumstances a higher level property, such as the casting of a vote. Constitution itself is envisaged as a relation of unity without identity. That is, the voting is not identical to the hand raising. In different circumstances, the same hand-raising action could constitute something else or nothing at all. But given the vote favourable circumstances, that is, given that the hand-raising takes place in an environment where voting by a show of hands is established by convention, as well as background factors such as that the participants are persons capable of adopting a first-person perspective and so on, the hand-raising is the voting. The is not of identity or predication, but of constitution. And not only that, but the essential identity, what Baker calls the primary kind property of lower level constitutors, is subsumed by that of the things they constitute, So the hand raising, for instance, is not primarily or essentially a hand raising, but a voting. Now, it's central to Baker's account that some objects and properties, like the property of being a piece of marble, would be just the same if there was no intentionality in the world. However, other objects and properties are intention dependent or ID. These include both the familiar mental properties of persons and properties like, say, being the collapse of a financial institution whose existence presupposes the existence of bearers of propositional attitudes. However, according to the account, higher level constituted entities, including mental or ID property instances, are nevertheless physical in the same way that their lower level constitutors are physical, which includes their having the same kinds of causal effects as those constitutors. This follows directly from Baker's insistence that constituted entities are of the same basic kind of stuff as their constitutors, from which it follows that despite being at different ontological levels, constituted and constituting entities are able to interact causally. But it's also part of the account that these higher level entities acquire, through their constitution, new, independent and irreducible causal powers that their constitutors don't possess. Baker expresses this second claim in what she calls the principle of independent causal efficacy. Informally, it says a higher level property instance, say a voting, has independent causal efficacy if first it would have had the effect even if its constituting property instance had been different. So a voting would have had the same effect if instead of a hand raising it had been constituted by an electronic ballot, say. And the second feature of independent causal efficacy is that through its constitution, the voting acquires causal powers that its constitutor could not have had alone. And the independence means, here introducing one of Professor Baker's examples that we're going to be looking at more closely later. The independence means that an independent ID causal effect, such as when in some committee Jones votes against Smith and this causes Smith to become angry, this relation is independent of any lower level causal pathway that might exist between, say, Jones' hand raising and some event in Smith's brain which constitutes Smith becoming angry. I'll turn now to what I believe are the differences between ID and manifest physical causation. First of all, why that term manifest? I mean manifest physical causation to be the kind of non-ID causation that occurs in the everyday world that Wilfrid Sellars depicted as forming the manifest image of man in the world, which he opposes to the scientific image. I mean to contrast the causal behaviour of the ordinary physical objects around us with a theoretical conception of causation at a fundamental microphysical level. The contrast matters, I think, because Professor Baker has exploited the possibility that no fundamental causal level actually exists in order to refute Kim's principle of causal explanatory exclusion. That's the principle, of course, that there is no more than one complete and independent cause or causal explanation of any event, usually combined with the assumption that that one cause is the fundamental one. And Baker argues that even the possibility that there's no bottom causal level is enough to falsify Kim's principle. And this would leave it open that there are multiple levels of cause and causal explanation of equal validity and equal ontological status. Now, I'm personally inclined to agree with Kim and others that what we know as causation emerges, if that's the word, at some higher level than the fundamental. But leaving that aside, I don't think that what may or may not be the case at fundamental levels is what needs to be taken into account when we're looking at causation among non-fundamental physical objects, as I've explained. Sellars himself famously asserts that the only existents are the entities found in the scientific image. Professor Baker, of course, vigorously opposes that view. As she says, Science tells us not what exists, but what else exists, end quote. The reasons for upholding the existence of everyday objects are mainly pragmatic and commonsensical. And while I agree with her in that, I also take seriously John McDowell's Kantian or transcendental argument that it is a condition of the very possibility of our being capable of conceptual activity at all that we should be under rational constraint by the world. And the world that constrains us, of course, is not the world of fundamental physics, but the perceived world of ordinary things. And I would add that in our time, as opposed to, say, the 17th century, the manifest image has become extended so that we may include in the perceptible world such things as neurons and protein molecules, many other entities that are the subject matter of the special physical sciences, both because their existence is hardly in doubt, and because we know they behave causally in the same way as macroscopic objects do. I'll come to what I mean by in the same way. Now, Professor Baker would agree that there are objective truths about the everyday world. Objective not in the sense of being completely independent of minds, but in the sense that both she and John McDowell share of being recognition independent. That is true or false regardless of anyone's attitude to them. I would claim that these truths include causal truths and falsehoods, so that there are facts, recognition independently true, manifest physical causal statements, like, say, the lightning strike caused the forest fire, about the inanimate, non-ID objects of our world. So, to get to the distinction between ID and manifest physical causation, I'm going to argue first that our ordinary causal talk conceals, quite harmlessly, but conceals this distinction. In almost all our causal discourse, I suggest we use cause and because interchangeably. Not only do we use causal locutions in order to causally explain, we also assume that to give a causal explanation is thereby to identify a cause. And we routinely use mental or other ID causal descriptions alongside and mixed in with non-ID manifest physical causal descriptions, such that we explain an ID effect by citing a non-ID cause, like, say, the earthquake caused economic upheaval, or vice versa. For example, he purposely threw the ball that smashed the window, or human economic activity is a cause of climate change. And as well as these, there are, of course, a multitude of cases in which both cause and effect are ID. For example, Jones voting against Smith made Smith angry, or excessive subprime mortgage lending caused the recession. The use of cause in statements like these is relaxed, doesn't imply any commitment to metaphysically rigorous understanding of cause, and this allows the causal relata in these statements to switch freely among events, facts, states, and so on. Also, causal explanations like these are easily able to incorporate things like causation by omission or prevention or cases of overdetermination. Now, Timothy Williamson writes, humans think in terms of cause and effect because of convenience, not because there's something physical corresponding to cause which humans experience, end quote. This, I think, also to some extent reflects Professor Baker's official view, though I think only to some extent, because she has devoted a lot of effort to arguing against Kim, for example, that ID causation is real. I argue, however, that there is a second sense in which cause is used, the manifest physical sense, which presupposes that there is something physical corresponding to cause. This use of cause is embedded in our ordinary causal discourse, but the causes and effect that are related in manifest physical causal claims do not presuppose the existence of bearers of propositional attitudes, as in, for example, again, a lightning strike caused the forest fire, or local electrical depolarization causes opening of voltage-gated ion channels. These causal statements are free of norms. The holding of the causal relation does not depend on purpose, justification, oughtness, or any other features of the intentional. These causings are physical, but not in any fundamental state, and their relata are generally taken to be events, so that is not an essential part of the argument. I make three claims on behalf of physical causation. I'll try to drop the word manifest now. The first is that it is productive and only productive, in the sense that it's usually contrasted with the weaker notion of dependence. That is, it has what is sometimes called biffiness, or sometimes oomph, which are ways of saying that it involves transfer of energy, usually mechanical or electromagnetic or chemical, as when a baseball smashes a window, or when a chemical gradient forces the flow of ions across a membrane. According to Ned Hall, who has written a lot on this, productive causality also has the features of intrinsicness. That is, relational factors do not contribute to productive causal powers, and locality or spatio-temporal contiguity, in that cause and effect are connected in a way that is describable in terms of physical laws or mechanisms. I can't defend the productive claim in detail right now, but I'll just note that one of the arguments against the productive view is that it can't account for causation by omission or prevention, since obviously in these cases there is no energy transfer or contiguity involved. For example, it's claimed in a case where an assassin shoots a victim through the heart, death is caused by the absence of oxygen going to the brain, so the causal process here can't be productive. But I suggest that if we look at what happens here, not in the context of an assassination, but at a lower or simpler level of description, in other words, if we bracket our natural tendency to think of the life-death contrast as the all-important feature of what's happening, we can describe the process without needing to bring in disconnections or omissions. And we don't have to go anything like as deep as a fundamental level to do this. We can describe what happens in terms of productive causation, of positive changes in intracellular metabolism in the victim's brain as cell metabolism moves towards equilibrium. The second feature of physical causation I want to emphasize, again I haven't time to argue for it in detail, is that it works through mechanisms. If we take a mechanism on one definition to be a set of systems or processes that produce phenomena in virtue of the arrangement and interaction of a number of parts, we can see how descriptions that include these arrangements and interactions allow omissions and preventions to come into the picture. Discovery of a mechanism.
10 minutes.
To go?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll speed up. Has been described as the gold standard for establishing and explaining causal connections, and it's claimed that any non-fundamental physical event, like a baseball breaking a window where the arrangements and interactions are ephemeral and not repeated, qualifies as a mechanism. The final feature I claim for physical causation is that it is physically causally closed. Manifest physical effects have complete and exclusively physical causes. And I think this is something about which we have a deep intuition. When we are faced by counter-examples to this, we're inclined to think that either it's a miracle or it's somebody is pulling one over on us, it's some kind of magic trick. I've spent some time on physical causation to underline that when we say that Jones's voting caused Smith's anger, the causal relations in these claims have none of the features of manifest physical causation. Jones's angering Smith is not productive, doesn't involve any mechanism in the sense I've been using, and I'll argue the question of whether it's physically causally closed turns out to be misconceived. which finally brings me to my main argument. Could somebody fix a slide for me, please? Slide? Thanks. If what I've said about physical causation is right, Baker's principle of independent causal efficacy will have to be modified. The example she uses to illustrate the principle is represented on the slide. We see Jones's hand-raising constitutes his voting. Smith's acquisition of a particular neural state constitutes his becoming angry, and Jones's voting causes Smith's anger. The two components of the efficacy principle are, as we said, first, Jones's voting would still make Smith's anger if it was constituted by other means. Secondly, Jones's hand-raising, by virtue of constituting the voting, acquires the new and irreducible power to make Smith angry, which it would not have had if it hadn't constituted a voting. On this point, Professor Baker is quite explicit. There is no upward causation here. No diagonal arrow, causal arrow, goes from Jones's hand-raising to Smith's anger. Baker writes, the contribution of Jones's hand going up was exhausted by the fact that the hand going up constituted a vote against Smith. So, does this establish independent causal efficacy? Initially, it appears so, but note that it is a premise of the argument that Jones's voting is indeed the cause of Smith's anger. This, of course, is something we all understand from a common sense perspective, but I suggest that the existence of this causal relation needs to be established from within the structure of the example, which as it stands shows only that if the central causal claim is correct, the principle of causal efficacy is vindicated. Furthermore, Professor Baker insists that Jones's voting causing Smith's anger does not depend on any lower level connection between their constitutors, but what am I not doing right? But I don't think it can be denied that a lower level connection between the constitutors actually exists. During the exact time period when the ID causal event occurs, light rays travel from Jones's hand to Smith's retinas. From there, neural pathways take messages to his visual cortex, thence to other parts of his brain, culminating in a particular neural event. And provided the favourable circumstances of Smith's correctly taking himself to be in the appropriate situation, and so on, are present, this neural event constitutes Smith's getting angry. So it appears that not only does the example not show that the voting causes the anger, it suggests that that premise is unnecessary. Either Smith's anger is overdetermined by the vote and the causal chain, or the role of Smith's voting is cast into doubt. Slide 3. And note, the existence of the ID causal relation is not entailed by the existence of the lower one. There is no equivalent at the ID level of the physical and neural events that form the physical causal chain. In fact, in my view, nothing connects the voting with the anger as such. Further problems arise, I think, when we consider again Baker's insistence that all property incidents, including mental, are physical, which indeed seems to follow from constitutions being a relation of unity without identity. So Jones's hand-raising and his voting are both physical properties of Jones, although the voting has causal powers not shared by the hand-raising. And on Baker's account, these would have to be physical causal powers, the same kind as the lower level ones. But the voting is the hand-raising, the is of constitution, given the presence of favourable circumstances. And these circumstances are relational properties of the hand-raising. That it takes place in an environment where certain conventions apply and so on. If my account of physical causation, manifest physical causation, is right, properties like these simply cannot be physical in that sense. Being in an environment where conventions apply is not the kind of property that could possibly contribute to any physical process involving energy transfer, spatial, temporal, contiguity, or mechanism. So where could the new causal powers have come from, if indeed they are physical causal powers? My conclusion is that if Jones's voting indeed causes Smith's anger, as common sense tells us it does, to label the relation physical is just to obscure the fact that it would appear to be a quite different kind of causal relation from the one whereby Jones's hand-raising causes Smith's neural state. So my solution, the last slide please, is to propose that not just the cause, Jones's voting, and the effect, Smith's getting angry, are constituted, but that the causal relation between them, a purely ID causal relation, is constituted in favourable circumstances by the causal relation at the lower level. In this extension of Baker's constitution account, which I call Constitutive Causation, the favourable circumstances for a lower level causal relation to constitute a higher one must include that the cause and effect properties of the lower level of the relation individually constitute those of the higher, as well as other factors, which in our example would be that the right psychological, social and environmental factors be present to make it rationally and emotionally appropriate from Smith's point of view for him to become angry on realising that Jones has voted against him. Instead of being linked by energy transfer, the links between the relata of constituted ID causation are normative, inferential and psychological. Causes thus become not forces at this level, but reasons. They don't have causal effects in the physical world because they're just not the kinds of things that could. Instead, they form the relata of what Davidson calls the constitutive ideal of rationality, or what McDowell calls the space of reasons. However, the two causal nexuses are intimately linked by the constitution relation of unity without identity. Jones's voting causing Smith's anger just is Jones's hand-raising causing Smith's neural state via the causal chain, but the higher relation is enriched through its being endowed with the intentional and normative properties of a causal relation between bearers of essential first-personal conceptual capacities in a human cultural setting. And if Professor Baker is right that constituted entities ontologically subsume their constitutors, then this gives us what we want, a philosophical as well as a common sense reason for regarding Jones's voting rather than a physical causal chain as the real cause and the real explanation of Smith's getting angry. I'll just finish by looking very briefly at an example that Baker uses in chapter 10 of Naturalism and the First Person Perspective to establish the reality of downward causation. We've already noted that there's no upward causation in the voting example, but Baker interprets a study that showed a correlation between posterior hippocampal size and navigational experience in London taxi drivers as showing that the experience, an ID property, causes the hippocampal change a lower level property. She writes that to deny that cases like this are examples of downward causation by giving a reductive interpretation of upper level properties seems like a workaround. But to me, the idea that content, navigational learning, could do this with no intermediary smacks of telekinesis perhaps, or some kind of magic. I think the schema I've just presented gives a more acceptable explanation. Changes in other areas of the brain cause the hippocampal changes and constitute the learning. That causal relationship constitutes the higher one between the learning and the increased navigational skills that are constituted by the hippocampal enlargement. So there's no need to resort to downward causation. More importantly, I don't think this could be interpreted as a reductive explanation or interpretation. On the contrary, if Baker's account is correct, we can claim that the learning is the real causal explanation of the taxi driver's heightened navigational skills. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McKay. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Professor Baker?
Thank you.
Just a moment. Microphone rise.
Thank you very much, Professor McKay. That was very nice. And I have actually two questions. One is, if you think that Jones's raising his hand causes Smith's mental states or his neural states, that seems like downward causation to me. First of all, raising your hand is already intentional. They'll just say his hand's rising because his neural change in his neural states. That seems like downward causation to me.
No, well, I would say not. I think there's what I've just called a manifest physical causal pathway. I mean, first of all, light waves from his hand to Smith's eye, then neural impulses. I mean, nothing intentional happens there.
Okay, that's true. That's true. Well, let me try another example instead of the taxi drivers. I've used that example several times, as you no doubt know. And here's one that is another study. Stress causes premature aging. Stress causes telomere shortening, and that's premature aging. And stress is going to be an intentionally understood, will have to do with you, and it won't be a manifest physical causation between you and your environment, but will be something that will involve your interpretation or something that stresses you out.
Well, again, I would say that the stress is something is constituting stress. If stress is interpreted as an ID phenomenon, psychological, so ID phenomenon, then something is constituting it, and that something is neural. So the causing of the telomere shortening, again, one doesn't get, as Kim would say, you don't come outside the physical domain. But I would say then that this neural thing constituting the telomere shortening, that causal relation constitutes, in the way I've developed here, a relation between stress and something else ID, like aging, aging as described in intentional terms, if you like.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, I have a question. You seem to suppose that there is some kind of primacy for the lower level compared to the higher level. So the lower level where Jones raises his hand compared to Jones votes. Now, why can't you say that we are just dealing with different description of one and the same event? And depending on what we want to know, we use different kinds of description, but there is no primacy for one of those descriptions. I think one of the advantages of this account would be that it's not really true that Jones's raising his hand explains why Smith gets angry. It's only when his raising his hand constitutes an act of voting. And that is something that you can account for if you say Jones voting causes Smith getting angry, but only in those cases where but not just his raising his hand. So the higher level description really gives you the explanation why Smith gets angry only on some occasion of Jones raising his hands. So it's the more precise description. That's why we might favor this description over the other one. While there might other conditions, for instance, imagine that the other guy can't distinguish between, or it might be a monkey or whatever, can't distinguish between voting and non-voting, but just distinguishes between hand raising and non-hand raising, then the other description would be better. So why?
Well, first of all, I don't disagree with really any of that, but I would say that I'm not claiming that the lower level description has a primacy. I think one of the beauties of the Constitution account, whereby constituted entities subsume the identity of their constitutors, means that in fact, in the case of Smith and Jones, the higher level cause and explanation has the ontological as well as the explanatory primacy. But I agree with it. They are two descriptions of the same thing, because again, the other beauty of the Constitution account, it is unity without identity. So, the hand raising just is the voting, but the description is enriched by its having taken place in a culture and an environment of where there are people and with their perspectives and there is culture, etc. So,
is there time for a follow-up? Yeah.
Very, very, very quickly, because we have another
sorry.
question.
It's just, I mean, the difference. The difference between constitutive relation and the identity relation is that the identity relation is symmetrical, whereas the constitutive is not symmetrical. So why could you say, well, it's the same, or I can change between constitutive and descriptive?
I'm not sure what to say to that. It is an asymmetrical relation, but they can both be used to describe. I mean, if you give the sort of manifest physical description of the event of the hand raising causing the neural state, what you're doing is you're giving, I think, a bracketed kind of impoverished description of what happens. I mean, that's what science, the adoption of the view from nowhere, so that you bracket out your own personality and all sort of intentional interests like that.
Okay. 1 minute for the question, 1.5 minutes for the answer.
1 minute for the question, 1.5 minutes for the answer?
That's unfair. So just quickly, in answering the interesting question, you said that you don't think there is priority in it. I don't understand it. You talked about the explanatory level, on which I grant this to you absolutely, but also on the ontological level, because it seems that you are endorsing some form of ontological priority of the physical level. First of all, because it's the constitutive level, and second of all, if I... No? You have an advocate here somewhere.
Professor Becker.
No, okay. No, perhaps I missed something in your presentation, but what about the causal closure of the physical world? Do you endorse that?
Yes.
That's the priority then, right? The ontological priority. If you have this principle, there is a priority of the physical world on the rest of the...
That's what Kim would say, but I would say that the constitution relation enables the constituted, even despite the physical causal closure, the constituted relation subsumes that through the relation of constitution. I've lifted that wholesale from Professor Baker's own.
Yep. But Lynne, I don't think Lynne accepts the Kim's principle, right? Or the causal closure.
No.
Yes. What about you?
Yeah, I do, but I mean.
But if you do, I wonder if there, in what sense, it's easy to say why Lynne thinks that there is no priority to the physical level. But in your case, because you accept this principle of closure, why there is no causal ontological priority?
Well, I mean, how can I put it? I mean, there is, I'm saying that everything that goes on, everything that happens physically in the world could be given a complete physical description, including this room and the neural states of everybody in it, and everything would be just the same from the perspective of some kind of supercomputer that was looking at it all. But I'm saying that despite that physical causal closure, in favorable circumstances, and that's the key, that Professor Baker's idea of the favorable circumstances that exist, which are the relational factors in the environment and historical factors and so on, which turn what could have a complete physical description into something much richer. something that has an intentional description. And I'm saying that that when that happens, you, as it were, leave behind, supersede the physical description.
In explanatory sense.
Well, I will remain neutral on whether it's an ontological sense, but I would say that Professor Baker would say it was in an ontological sense.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.